Tracy Marshall. I'm co-producing this series at the Hamptons Institute for the third year, along with Alec Baldwin, who's with us somewhere here tonight. And we're so excited about this series, especially this year, as we have really focused on important topics that affect not only the world, but also very much the East End of Long Island and our communities. And we started the series the first week with the plastics pollution panel and the huge impact that it has out here, and we're hoping that it will ignite some activism within the community to help with that. Last week we addressed Me Too, and tonight probably the one with the most life and death consequences, the opioid epidemic. So we have a fantastic panel lined up. Elizabeth Vargas is going to lead the way. Elizabeth, would you like to come out with the rest of the panel? So thank you for being here. Come on out. And we will be getting to some questions at the end. In the meantime, please welcome our guests.
Good evening. I'll give you a proper introduction to our illustrious panelists tonight who are going to help have an amazing discussion on this issue. Right here is Patrick Radden Keefe. He's a staff writer at the New Yorker magazine, and he wrote an astonishing cover story article for the New Yorker called Empire of Pain, an investigation on the role of the Sackler family and their company Purdue Pharma in the opioid crisis. Also, we have Admiral Sandy Winnefeld at the very end of the panel. He spent 37 years in the military serving our country, most recently as the Vice Chair, Joint Chiefs of Staff. He and his wife, Mary, have co-founded an organization called Stop the Addiction Fatality Epidemic. They did so after losing their son just days into his freshman year in college to an overdose. And finally, we have Dr. Joseph Garbely, who's an addiction medicine specialist. He's also medical director of Caron Treatment Center, which is one of, if not the leading treatment centers in the nation, helping treat people, helping families in crisis as they deal with this. I'm sure we all saw the headlines from the New York Times and every other leading newspaper. 72,000 Americans died last year of drug overdoses, and it's a record number. It reflects a rise of 10% from the previous year in drug overdose deaths, and the death toll from drug overdoses is now higher than the peak yearly death totals from HIV, car crashes, and gun deaths. As we know, President Trump has declared this a public health emergency. This emergency touched you, Admiral, very close. To your heart. What happened to your son? I know that you tried desperately hard to get him the very best treatment you could.
Well, we are, first of all, let me thank the Institute and the community for your interest in this very, very important topic. It's heartwarming that you would do an event like this. We are living proof that this epidemic doesn't care if you're young or old, black or white, male or female, rich or poor, Democrat or Republican. It doesn't respect any of that. And it visited our family. Our son Jonathan grew up in a military family, 5 different school districts in 6 years at one point in his life, moved around a lot. He was a courageous, young, likable kid, didn't have an enemy in the world, a gifted baseball pitcher, very creative. But he suffered most of his life with anxiety and depression. And it's a longer story than this, but ultimately ended up self-medicating to deal with those demons and became addicted to marijuana, to alcohol, to other drugs. We got him into 15 months of intensive inpatient treatment in a couple of wonderful facilities. He was doing very, very well. He got his EMT qualification towards the end of his treatment. He was excited. He wanted to help other people towards the end of his treatment. He was in his EMT qualification, did an ambulance ride in New Haven, Connecticut, and found himself in a McDonald's bathroom performing CPR personally on somebody going through a heroin overdose, and decided right then and there that he was going to try to help people who could not help themselves. Decided to go to college, University of Denver, wanted to become a paramedic fireman after that. But the demons of this drug recaptured him shortly after he left his inpatient treatment, which is sometimes the case, and we lost him on his 4th day of college.
He had taken drugs that were laced with fentanyl.
He died of a fentanyl-laced dose of heroin that he purchased in an open-air heroin market in Denver, Colorado.
You had no idea that he had relapsed, even though looking back now you realize you missed some signs.
We missed a few signs. We took him up to our house in the mountains in Colorado the weekend before we dropped him off at school, and we noticed that he was a little edgy, a little sweaty, a little nervous, and we just thought that was Jonathan's natural tendency towards anxiety before doing something big like going to college. The day we dropped him off at school, he was amazingly good-looking, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, excited, and it was like, here he's gone through his EMT training, he's written this powerful essay that he had to write, which we have a copy of in the outer hall that's required of each Denver University freshman. He looks good, touchdown. This kid is there. And little did we know that he had relapsed. The things we saw in the mountains were signs of withdrawal, and we lost him. It's very sad. It's a moment of sadness that will stay with us for the rest of our lives. And as we'll probably discuss later, we've decided to carry on his mission of helping people avoid this in our own lives.
The most awful thing any parent can experience is the loss of a child. It's admirable that you and your wife have chosen to turn this tragedy into, and we're going to get to what you hope some solutions may be. But doctor, I've got to ask you, this story that you just heard, not unusual?
No, it's very familiar to me. It's familiar to everyone that works in this industry. We are in the 3rd phase of this opioid use disorder epidemic, and it's the deadliest phase of all. It's the fentanyl phase, if you will. It's synthetic opioids, congeners of fentanyl, precursors of fentanyl.
Hold on, what were the first 2 phases?
So the first phase began, honestly, with us, physicians. We have to bear responsibility. There was a movement to look at pain in a different way coming out of the 80s, and there was a real focus on making pain the 5th vital sign so that we would pay attention to it, and we needed to do that. Back then, all we could do is write prescriptions. So if someone said they had pain, whether that's why they came to see you or not, they left with a prescription for an opioid. And that ballooned out of control. And from 1999 to 2009, prescriptions for opioids quadrupled. And also deaths from opioids quadrupled in that period of time.
I'm going to come back to you in just a second, but Patrick, this is exactly what she wrote about in this article. What was happening during the time that the doctor was just describing? Why did these prescriptions for these pain medications, these opioid medications, quadruple, balloon, explode?
Yeah, thank you. Look, I think there's a tendency sometimes when we talk about this this crisis, in part because of the magnitude of it and the complexity of it, which is something we'll also talk about, to think of it as like a natural disaster, a natural catastrophe that just befell this country and other countries around the world. And I think when you look at the history, it was much more man-made than
it was
we might like to
manufactured.
acknowledge. It was manufactured, and I think that the strong opioids, as kind of medications derived from the opium poppy are known, had been available to physicians, but something that people were very, very careful about for decades, precisely out of a fear that they were highly addictive. And so this was something that you would prescribe in for severe cancer pain, end-of-life care type of situations, not for chronic pain. And the piece that I wrote in the New Yorker was about one company, Purdue Pharma, which is a privately held company owned by the Sackler family, who some of you may know. They summer here. This company, during the 1990s, developed a new drug, OxyContin. And the idea was this was a very powerful dose of oxycodone that could be released into your bloodstream continuously over a series of hours. So the idea is that it could provide long-term pain relief. You would only need to take 2 pills every 24 hours. And if you look now at the history, what happened was, with this product, which was potentially going to be a blockbuster drug, the company faced a challenge, which was that American physicians were reluctant to prescribe this sort of medication for people who weren't in one of those very severe types of situations. And so they started a pretty systematic effort to change the minds and the prescribing habits of American physicians and persuade them that actually not so addictive, actually this was safe for a wide range of conditions, and also safe to prescribe in kind of chronic circumstances in which people would just take it month in, month out. And that happened to coincide with the cultural shift that you're talking about in the culture of prescribing. But I would say, and I think you'd probably agree, and it wasn't just Purdue, but Purdue was really the pioneer here, that pharmaceutical companies really deliberately pushed to change the minds of American doctors in very slick and persuasive ways.
Using advertising campaigns and their own, getting their own medical journals to publish their own studies that their own labs conducted and that their own doctors then endorsed. I mean, it's quite circular when you look at it.
There was it was a what we would call it kind of a self-licking ice cream cone. Yeah. But you were going to jump in.
No, and I'm a victim of that ice cream cone, I have to say. We really did think that OxyContin was less addictive than other choices and felt safe to prescribe it because the pharmaceutical...
Because you were told that.
Yeah, we were told that. The pharmaceutical representatives came in with this grand proclamation that we can safely, finally prescribe opioids. And the studies that went behind it were all manufactured by the company, and we bought it hook, line, and sinker, I would say.
And yet internal company documents show that toward the end, for at least, according to some reports, years, the company knew that, there's a problem here. This is highly addictive, and this is being terribly abused, while they were still publicly saying it was perfectly safe.
Yeah, I mean, this was again, there are other pharmaceutical companies that play a role here, but Purdue was the first, and I think in some ways the most egregious, and there's been a great deal of investigation into the company, and we know that almost from the outset, it was clear that people were abusing the drug. The original selling point had been this idea that you could take 2 pills a day, which was, if you think about it, if you have a serious pain condition, that's enormous, that you don't have to wake up in the middle of the night in order to do another dose. But even from the initial trials, what they found was that people were going into withdrawal after 8 or 9 hours. And they nevertheless came out and sold this drug as something that you needed to take every 12 hours. But of course, if you think about it, just intuitively, you have a drug that you're dosing on a 12-hour basis and you're going into withdrawal after 9, that's a recipe for addiction. So the company knew this very early on. The Sackler family knew this very early on. There were memos going back informing them that the drug was being abused. And I think there's an interesting aspect to this story, which is that confronted in the really early days with the signs here and there, little pockets of abuse across the country, that this was not going according to plan, the company didn't do what you could do, which is really engage and think, boy, we've got a problem here. What have we put out into the marketplace? Instead, they essentially denied. They said these are just drug addicts. These are drug abusers who are not using the drug as prescribed. And they hired Rudy Giuliani to fight off any regulation.
Well, it's hard enough for a public board to take the kind of action. For a privately owned company like this, it's even harder, I think. And so that's where you end up. And then we found in the second phase of this thing, which I know Doctor can talk about, when people began to lose their access to these drugs, either because their physicians wouldn't prescribe them for them, or they ran out of money, because on the illicit market, OxyContin is $1 a milligram, and if you need 3 now, 80-milligram pills a day, you're talking $240 a day, which a lot of people can't afford when a $20 hit of heroin is all it takes. And now you have the Mexican black tar heroin finding its way into the country with a very clever scheme of Mexican families, not cartels, but families, who are going to agree not to use violence against each other because they don't want to draw the attention of law enforcement. And it rapidly propagates across the country and is just a nice safety net there waiting for the people falling off of OxyContin because they cannot afford to buy it to jump right into black tar heroin.
Doctor, do we have any statistics? Do we know what percentage of patients who took OxyContin or any kinds of these opioid pain relievers who become addicted?
There's several studies looking at monozygotic twins, so identical twin studies, and the addiction rate with repetitive use is around 80%, a little over 80%.
80%?
Yes, for opioids. Now, that's a physical tolerance that someone develops from the medication that's prescribed. But a certain percentage of them are using it in a non-medical use fashion, using it to get high for the euphoria that they get from it. But yes, there's a tolerance that happens with these medications almost universally.
And there's another statistic that is 4 out of 5 people in the country today that are using heroin started with prescription drugs.
That was my next
that
question.
were either prescribed by a doctor, given to them by a friend, or just bought illicitly.
So 4 out of 5 people using heroin in the United States today started using prescription drugs, painkillers.
That's right. And we're roughly 4.1% of the world's population, and we prescribe 80% of the world's opioids and 99% of the world's hydrocodone. Either the rest of the world is in excruciating pain, or we're doing something wrong.
I mean,
And while we're on
the
it-
statistics are astonishing. That, in the state of Ohio, 1 in 5 people has a prescription for opioids.
Here's another 2 statistics that will get you. More people consume opioids in the country than smoke cigarettes. And there's a baby born every 20 minutes that's addicted to heroin or some kind of opioid-based drug.
So this is the sheer enormity of the problem is staggering, which begs the question, of course, why aren't we doing something? Why aren't we doing something? Why aren't we doing more? It's been declared a public health emergency. We have more, this is like a 747 crashing every single day. That's how many, and just for opioids. We're not talking about other addictions. Why as a nation aren't we doing more? And is it, as so many have said, is it the number one problem is the stigma around the disease of addiction?
I would say the stigma is still alive and well in keeping people from treatment. 10% of those who need treatment actually get it. 10%.
That means 90% of people who need treatment don't. Only 1 in
That's
10
correct.
people.
That is correct. And the stigma holds people back. There's also a reluctance to admit that you have a problem because of the backlash that can occur. We understand this in the medical community as a chronic disease, a relapsing, remitting chronic disease. There's no debate in science, in my world, in medicine, but there's great debate in the public arena, whether this actually is a moral failing or a lack of willpower. It's none of those. It's a disease.
But why is that? I mean, the AMA has classified addiction as a disease for decades now. Why has that not caught up to in the public imagination? Many people do, in fact, believe it's a choice. It's a lack of willpower. It's a lack of discipline, and not a disease. They don't understand what an addict goes through when he or she can't stop.
No, I think that the medical community has really shied away from identifying and treating addiction. I received little to no training in medical school. I'm an internist, board-certified internist, and board-certified psychiatrist. I got no training in addiction in either one of those residencies.
And that's very common. Most doctors
Yes,
receive
that's correct.
absolutely no training in addiction, spotting it, treating it.
That's correct.
And they're also not incentivized to warn their patients. I've done an unscientific informal survey for going on 5 months of anybody I've known who has had a medical procedure, a dental procedure, or an injury of some sort, and was prescribed opioids. And I just asked a very simple question. Did your doctor or dentist give you a verbal warning about the hazards of using these drugs? And 0, literally 0, have come back to me and said yes. And in fact, many of them have come back and said, not only that, did I not get a verbal warning, the doctor or dentist demanded that I fill the prescription. And you ask yourself, well, why? What's going on here? There really are 2 things. The first is that doctors and hospitals are being evaluated by how well they treat pain. Insurance companies are involved in this, and nobody wants to get a bad evaluation. And the other reason is there's no dentist that wants to be woken up in the middle of the night by a patient who says, what you did to me really hurts. So it's sort of, take this drug. So there is very little incentive for the medical community, the dental community, to get this under control.
I'd also add that there are a whole bunch of factors, but one I'd point out is that there is a huge amount of lobbying money put up by the painkiller industry, even now, even today, to fight often what strike me as quite common sense measures. So painkiller producers in America spend 9 times as much as the gun lobby on lobbying.
9 times as much as the NRA?
Yeah. And a couple of years ago, the CDC put out a set of non-binding guidelines, essentially the kind of thing you're talking about. At what point do you prescribe strong opioids? Are there alternatives that you can talk about first? Physical therapy, various other alternatives to strong opioids. If you are going to prescribe, try and do so at the kind of lowest possible dosage for the shortest period of time. Non-binding. They just wanted to put these out kind of as a form of education for prescribers. And there was a huge effort to kill that in Washington, funded by the producers of painkillers. So on the one hand, a lot of these companies today will say, yes, we acknowledge there is an opioid crisis. It's gotten past the point where they can deny that we have an issue or indeed that these drugs are addictive. But behind the scenes, they will nevertheless, I think, often go to great lengths to try and stop precisely the kind of common sense things that you could see.
And most of them are involved in reputation cleansing right now anyway in face of a pretty big lawsuit. If stigma is public enemy number 1, and it really is here, and we talked about this earlier, while there has been some outstanding print journalism, and we have Exhibit A with us tonight on that, not only here, but also books like Sam Quinones' Dreamland. There's a new book that's right in the bookstore right down the street called Dope Sick, which is good. Excellent journalism. The photojournalism, though, I would throw on the pile as being very harmful.
Why?
Because the most powerful, gripping images of people who are suffering from this disease are those of people who are skinny with tattoos and needle marks in their arms, living under underpasses. And the fact is that most of the people dying from this epidemic don't fit that category. Now, there are plenty of them, but my son was not a tattooed, dope-sick guy living under an underpass. He was a college student who was suffering from a mental illness, who self-medicated and overdosed. So we kind of need to get that a little bit under control, because when people see those images, they say, well, that's not my family. There's nobody in my family living under an underpass.
Well, it's a shame anybody would say it because it doesn't look like somebody in my family. I don't care. I think, an addict is an addict, and a human being suffering is a human being suffering, no matter who and where they are. But nonetheless, the stigma around this is, I'm just curious, when you were struggling, when you realized your son needed help, your family was in crisis, and it was interesting, there was a New York Times article a couple of years ago on rehab centers, on corrupt and greedy rehab centers that have opened up and flourished all over the country, trying to take advantage of certain insurance laws and cashing in. And the lead line of the article said, most people spend more time deciding which restaurant to go have dinner in than they do which treatment center to send a loved one or send yourself to seek treatment for a drug or alcohol addiction. It's astonishing.
Yes, and the good news is that the American people are beginning to understand that there is an epidemic. The bad news is it is a terribly, terribly complex epidemic that operates at many levels. And if you are involved in it with a loved one, having been through this experience, you don't even know the right questions to ask.
You don't know who to call. You don't know where to go.
You don't know where to go. And there are some terrible treatment centers out there. There are some great treatment centers out there. But it is a really tough journey. And it's just this, every day I wake up and say, if I only knew then what I know now, we'd still have our son with us. So knowledge is power in this business. You have to learn everything you possibly can about this disease, from how it starts, how it works, what medication-assisted treatment really is, and how important it is, or you don't have a chance.
And just also at the beginning, I'll let you guys both jump in just a second. You actually finally only found out where to send your son by calling somebody that you knew who had somebody in their family who had suffered from addiction, which is how these families finally reach out.
My magnificent, tenacious, and beautiful spouse, Mary, who's in the audience tonight, spent 7 days desperately trying to find a place that could take our son, that could handle both the insurance aspects and the fact that he was on the cusp of his 18th birthday and a number of other complicating factors. And it was only when we did talk to a friend of a friend who said, go to this place, that we actually found somewhere. Now, that place was not covered by our insurance. We paid the equivalent of a Ivy League college 4-year education over 15 months out of our pocket on our military retirement to try to save our son's life.
Wow.
Can I just, I wanted to, you said if you'd known then what you know now. So what in particular?
First of all, hope would not be a strategy. It's very simple, easy for families to go, my son or daughter is going to get through this. Maybe they're using marijuana, maybe they're getting a little out of control, but we'll talk to them and they'll get it and they'll be fine. Point number one is they aren't. They are very deceptive. It's a spiraling disease that you don't understand if you haven't really studied it or been through it. So point number one, we would have gotten him into treatment much quicker. And then all of the various lessons learned that stack up along that, but the most important set of lessons for us was the transition out of treatment, which is where we lost him. And if you're going to understand that, you have to know a little bit about how the brain works. And that the way addiction works is we all have opioid receptors in our brains. They are naturally occurring. Naturally occurring endorphins are what give you pleasure and make you feel good. When you saturate those things with an external substance, an external opioid, makes you feel good, cures your pain for a while, and then you go into withdrawal and you need a little more. And then you need a little more. And that's how you get into addiction. What happens in that process is your opioid receptors are getting saturated, and that's why it takes more. Now you go through long-term treatment, and you come out on the other end of that, you're doing great, as our son was, and your opioid receptors are now stripped clean. They're reset. They're back to their normal state. And because your opioid receptors have a lot to do with respiration and consciousness, if you use the same dose that you needed when you were in the depths of addiction, you will probably kill yourself because you now totally saturate those receptors immediately. It knocks you out, and it suppresses your breathing, and you suffocate.
Doctor,
That's a lesson. So if we had known that, there are a number of things that we would have done, probably 4 or 5 things we would have done coming out of treatment to help our son get through that difficult process.
Right. And that's why medication-assisted treatment is so important.
Medication-assisted treatment.
Assisted treatment. Because
and yet there's so much pushback on it.
That's correct. I think...
Could you just explain a little bit?
Yeah, sure. There's 3 types of medication-assisted treatment. The first was invented in New York at Rockefeller University in 1964. That's methadone maintenance, and it's been around the longest. And people viewed that as really harm reduction when you think about methadone. It's a full agonist, so people can have a euphoric experience with it. And you're tied to a clinic, meaning you have to go there to get your medication.
Every day.
Every day, correct. So in 2000, around there, came office-based medication-assisted treatment in the form of buprenorphine. That is a partial agonist. So the intrinsic activity of that particular molecule is not anywhere near methadone. So the euphoria is non-existent. There might be a little of that, but not much at all.
But it removes the craving?
It removes the craving, that's correct. It removes the craving, and it's been shown to reduce overdose, a relapse risk and overdose from relapse.
It also takes care of the withdrawal.
That's correct. And then the most recent one is Vivitrol, which is a depot form of something called naltrexone, which is a pure opioid receptor antagonist. It just lays on the receptors, and has no intrinsic activity. It just blocks those receptors. So if someone were to relapse, they wouldn't die from their relapse, number one. Number two, it reduces craving, so they have less of a chance of relapsing.
And talk about that. The Admiral was just talking about that really fragile time just out of rehab. People have a tendency to say, I'm cured, or the family say, you're back, and you're all better. And there's actually, that's a really tenuous time.
It is. What the Admiral was referring to in medical parlance is called upregulation of receptors, which is an increase in number and affinity. So the receptors are hungry for opioids of any sort when someone leaves treatment. There's also changes.
Even after 15 months of treatment?
Yeah, that's correct, yeah. I mean, studies have been done at NIDA showing that changes are persistent long after 15 months.
And they've actually shown recovering substance abuse people pictures of drug paraphernalia. at speeds faster than the conscious brain can process, but the subconscious brain can process, and they can see the endorphins start flowing.
That's right. The amygdala, which stores memories, euphoric recall, lights up like a Christmas tree in those studies that the Admiral's talking about.
That's astonishing.
It is astonishing. And what happens in the brain when someone is in active addiction is the limbic cortex is where the reward center is, the reinforcing center of the brain. So when someone's using substances, that area is very active. And another area of the brain, which is the prefrontal cortex, which is where sound reasoning, good judgment, decision-making happens, is hypoactive. The activity is decreased. And that takes a long time to get active again. So when they come out of treatment, their receptors are hungry for opioids. They're not making good decisions because that part of the brain isn't turned on yet. So it's a recipe for disaster.
So I'm going to try something on the audience. We talk about gateway drugs, marijuana being potentially a gateway drug, what have you, into addiction. We talk about medication-assisted treatment, the 3 drugs doctor described, as gateway drugs to recovery. And they're very important. You may have also heard of a drug called Naloxone, which is the drug I happen to have in my pocket, which you can carry. You can put it in your high school. You can have your, I would imagine your law enforcement folks are carrying it, your first responders are. This will bring somebody out of an overdose. It does not cure them. It strips the opioid receptors and puts them deeply into withdrawal, but it will save their lives. So get this out into your communities, learn how to use it. It's something that will save people. And it saves lives every day.
The statistics on how many lives it's saved are, I mean, you two would know better than I would, but it's astonishing, right?
Absolutely astonishing. And when I do any of these panels, I always get a question, don't you think having naloxone out there in the public enables people to use more? That's the question I almost universally get. And it's hard to imagine where that question came from, but it's really from that stigma we keep talking about.
One of the things that we advocate very strongly, and I know Doc agrees, is something we call warm handoff. So now you have somebody who's in an overdose. You give them a squirt of this, it's literally like a nasal squirt, or you can inject it intravenously. And now you've saved them. But very often these people end up in emergency rooms and just put right back on the street.
Right,
We call it treat them and
released
street
after
them.
they're stabilized.
If you do warm handoff, you can now, in those emergency rooms, give them buprenorphine. That gives them a fighting chance to get actually the cravings controlled and into some sort of a long-term treatment. And that's what has been found generally to be the most effective way of getting somebody who's deeply addicted and overdosed on the road to potentially recovery.
Why is there such pushback, doctor, on these drugs that are used as gateway recovery drugs, or even lifetime? I mean, does a heroin addict have to take methadone for the rest of his or her life if he wants to stay sober?
Not necessarily. We don't know the answers to these questions yet, but the studies are being done. The how long question. But again, I would say to you that would we have this conversation around other chronic diseases, like lung disease or diabetes? Would we say, should they be on insulin the rest of their life? I don't think we would say that. So I think that's just another way of looking at it.
Is it a misperception? I mean, I've heard people say, oh, well, people take methadone to get high.
Right. I mean, the stigma around methadone has really injured all the later MAT strategies because they've adopted that stigma. Buprenorphine maintenance and also Vivitrol have adopted that stigma of methadone.
You hear it as substituting one drug for another. Living proof, I would gladly have substituted another drug for the drug that killed my son in a heartbeat. And we refer to it as medication-assisted treatment. It's not just one of those 3 drugs. You do need other help. And the diabetes example is fantastic. Your doctor will give you insulin for a while, but the doctor's also going to give you counseling to try to change your lifestyle. Same thing here.
In addition to the fact, doctors actually, I was surprised to read, need special training and permission, certification to prescribe some of these drugs. But they didn't need special certification or training to prescribe the original drug that got the patient hooked.
And we got no training, really. I mean, we have just been throwing opioids at chronic disease for so long. We have no other options until now when we're starting to find those other options. But insurance companies have to step up to the plate, and they have to fund these other alternative measures that treat chronic pain. That's not happening. So if you try to get someone in medical massage, acupuncture, physical therapy for a significant amount of time, good luck.
Why not? Why isn't it happening? I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of pushback.
It's cheaper. It's cheaper.
And pain treatment became a patient right in this country. I'll give a talk and I'll have a European come up to me after the talk and go, "What are you talking about? We don't do any of that stuff in Europe. Tylenol and suck it up. Pain is a naturally occurring phenomenon." So it really has an evolved right to be pain-free in this country that has caused this whole thing.
And the pills are cheaper for the insurance company. That's the other.
And the alternatives.
That's correct.
Yeah.
It's more expensive.
So you are at Caron Center, which is actually where your son went for.
He started there. He was there for 3 months.
He started there for 3 months.
And we think very highly of Caron. He left Caron because his next phase of treatment probably would have been in Florida, and he doesn't like hot weather, so we sent him to another good place in New Haven, Connecticut.
But my question to you, doctor, is why is good treatment so expensive, and why is so little of it, if any of it, ever covered by insurance?
Well, again, this is about the insurance companies. They've been looking at addiction as an acute disease. Think pneumonia, rash. You throw an episode of treatment at it, and then they should be better. And if they fail, if they relapse, it's on them. It's the patient's fault. We don't do that with other chronic
I was going to say,
diseases.
is there any other disease that we do that with?
No, absolutely not.
Yeah.
So, and what has emerged is that insurance will not pay for long episodes of treatment. They won't allow patients to be in treatment as long as they need to be in treatment. So good treatment centers have had to move away from insurance just to get good outcomes and successfully treat addiction.
And in their place have sprouted up a lot of corrupt treatment centers, which sadly, families will expend sorely needed resources sending a loved one who needs help to a center that we now know. I mean, I've done a lot of reporting on this myself. It's terrible what happens in some of these places.
Corrupt how? Can you give us an example?
They will be. There's very little counseling going on. There's a crop of them out in California, in particular, in Southern California. They encourage you to come back. The director of one of the centers in Malibu was getting high with some of the patients he was supposed to be treating.
That's corrupt. That's corrupt.
I'll give you another example. And some of it is.
I think that qualifies as corrupt.
Another example is financially driven. Is the treatment center will look for where the highest margin thing is that they can do that an insurance company will reimburse. And if it's the insurance company will, without asking any questions, reimburse you $1,000 for a urinalysis, then they'll give you a urinalysis every day.
Exactly.
As somebody in treatment, you don't need a urinalysis every day, maybe once a week. So
you're locked
that's
up
the
in
kind
rehab.
of behavior.
It's like, yeah, they're incredible. And what happens, and sadly, is a lot of those substandard, often corrupt treatment centers say, yes, we accept insurance, and our price is lower than some of the more traditional, highly regarded treatment centers. And families squander that little opportunity and what financial resources they have on what turns out not to be an effective way to treat
the other thing is very often people will go in for 30 days. And what I tell parents is that if you put your loved one into treatment for 30 days, you know what you get out of it? First of all, you get to spend a lot of money, but you get 30 days of sleep because you know your son or daughter's in a safe place. When they come out of it after 30 days, their brain has not had enough time to recover. And if they've got medication-assisted treatment as part of that, they might have a fighting chance if it's maintained afterwards, but they really need more time than that for their brain to recover.
And doctor, how do you treat opioid addiction different from all the other addictions? Does it take more time for the brain to reset? Is that when you talk about that flash frame of drug paraphernalia that you can't even consciously see but subconsciously register, and your amygdala is lighting up like a Christmas tree, I mean, a year later, I mean, how long does it take to treat an opioid addict?
It takes a lifetime. And that's the point I'm trying to make here. It's a chronic disease, and we have to treat it as such. So the initial episode of treatment needs to be long enough for their brain to quiet down and the cravings to get to a point where they're muted so that they can sit in treatment and get the most that they can out of treatment. We felt so strongly about a unique treatment plan for our opioid addicted patients that we started a standalone opioid treatment unit. So we have a unit that we pull everyone together. They're on different types of MAT. We just do buprenorphine maintenance and Vivitrol. That's the only two that we are able to do. Methadone clinics are separate from treatment centers, just so you know. And everyone gets looked at for the appropriate MAT. It's medication-assisted treatment, not medication as treatment. And it's very important that we find out what are the co-occurring mental health issues. Are there addiction and interaction disorder issues? What are the medical comorbidities? So we spend a lot of time and have a lot of highly trained professionals that are evaluating the patient, informing a treatment plan, and then it's a variable length of stay depending on the patient.
How many addicts also suffer from anxiety, depression, those
a significant
right,
number.
Exactly.
More
Most
than
are
50%.
self-medicating.
But I would also want to point out that the unbelievably high quality treatment Doc just described, there's not much of that in this country. There simply is not enough capacity. Follow the money. If the insurance companies would pay for this kind of thing, you would see these kinds of more Karens pop up, particularly if they're regulated carefully. There's a standard of care, standard of treatment, so that the lesser, and in fact unethical facilities can be shut down. We just don't have enough of this.
And there are places, I believe, a colleague of mine at the New Yorker wrote an amazing piece last year about West Virginia, where the suggestion is there are sort of treatment deserts, right? That there are big patches of the country, some of which happen to overlap with areas where this crisis is extremely acute, where there is no place within a 3 or 4 hour drive.
Yeah, we simply are, and it'd be interesting to have a discussion on this, we simply are not going to be able, even if we threw a lot of money at this problem, to produce enough Karens to take care of every substance-dependent person in the country.
I was going to say, there isn't the money for it, even with, how many states are suing right now? There's more than, do you know off the top of your head?
Not off the top of my head. I can tell you that more than half of the states are suing Purdue Pharma.
Are just Purdue Pharma.
Well, in the top 5. The top 5 companies.
But we were talking about this earlier, even if these class action lawsuits result in a huge billion-dollar settlement, it won't come close.
It won't be enough, yeah. It's interesting. So I spent a lot of time interviewing lawyers, both private lawyers and also prosecutors who are bringing cases on behalf of states, cities, municipalities that have been really severely affected by the crisis and trying to hold the pharmaceutical companies accountable. And the model for them is the tobacco litigation, the big tobacco litigation. And you remember the CEOs being hauled in and having to speak before Congress, and then there was a huge settlement which came to about $250 billion. The difference here is that even if there is some kind of an opportunity for Purdue and other, Johnson & Johnson, various other pharmaceutical companies to settle these cases, their pockets just aren't that deep. So you have the magnitude of the problem on the one hand, which is enormous, but on the other, even in the event that this litigation succeeds in arriving at some kind of settlement, you're probably talking about single-digit billions of dollars, which will be totally incommensurate to the needs.
And that's why the solution to this epidemic is so complex. If all we try to do is throw money at treatment, which we need to do plenty of, we will not solve this epidemic. There are a number of things, all of which are very closely interrelated, that our nation needs to do if we're going to get our arms around this thing. And not all of them are incredibly expensive. They cost money, to be sure. But unless we take on the holistic view of this problem, we're never going to get there. And it starts with awareness, prevention techniques, targeting the right audiences that are most vulnerable with the right messages, not just don't start. That doesn't work.
Or just say no.
Yeah. We just say KNOW because knowledge is power here. It goes to prescription medicine in the sense of training doctors and dentists and smart patients and take-back programs and disposal programs and that sort of thing. It goes to law enforcement and medical response to understand we can't arrest our way out of this problem by arresting people who are substance dependent. 85% of the people arrested in this country for a drug crime are users, not dealers. We got to flip that. We also have to get after, in that little genre there, the warm handoff piece that we talked about. And then, of course, treatment and recovery. And then there's a very important piece of this. Recovery is a family business. It takes strong families who understand what their loved one is going through, because there's a lot of bitterness and resentment and, frankly, hatred that can pop up when your family member is acting irrationally and selfishly and just won't come out of this. And it takes a lot of love to get through that. And it also takes empowering these families with the knowledge they need that we didn't have necessarily to get them through this process.
And that most families still don't have. It's actually shocking how many families don't have this kind of information. I serve on the board of the Center for Addiction, and that's what we're trying to do. And it's a huge mission and a huge thing to
Go to
try
our website, and we have a lessons learned section in there where you, and by the way, if you have a lesson learned, you can submit it on that website and give us your thoughts on what works, what doesn't work, on all facets of this, starting when they're in elementary school, through difficult years, adolescence, what have you, all the way through coming out of treatment. We would love to get those out to people.
Doctor, what do you do for the families of your patients at Caron? I mean, how do you help with that issue of, you know, once that you've done all you can for this addict, this person suffering from this terrible disease, and then you release them, and how do you prepare these families? How many families are able to do what the Admiral just described, which is set aside all the resentment and anger and hurt and be able to support that addict in that fragile time of early recovery?
Well, in the primary phase of treatment, we have what's called a family education program. It's 5 days. The first 2 days are pure education, where we are literally lecturing the family on the neurobiology and the neurochemistry of the disease. My docs and I do those lectures. And then we educate them about all the things we're talking about now, how this epidemic got going, where it's at, and medication-assisted treatment. And then the last 3 days is with the family, with their son, their daughter, their loved one, what have you. And then in Florida, if they do transfer down to our program in Florida, they go through something called family restructuring, where they're actually in treatment themselves, learning to become a more functional family.
Do families ever resist?
Yes. But we're dogged in our determination to get families to our education program and restructuring as well.
Because you know that really you will only be able to keep that person on the road to recovery with the family support.
It's a family disease, and if the family remains sick and we put the loved one back in that family, they're going to relapse.
I'm curious what's happening now in with opiates and prescription pain pills. I mean, now that we no longer have a debate on whether or not they're addictive, what are the pharmaceutical companies doing? Are they?
I mean, so there's a number of answers to that. I mean, one thing I would say, just because it's a note we've kind of skirted but not sounded directly, is so part of the problem here, right, is if you have somebody who's addicted to opioids, you need to handle them very carefully. And there are a lot of people who worry that that if you put the brakes on prescribing, or if you have a situation where somebody's suddenly worried that they're not going to be able to get their prescription, that's actually a way to drive people to the street. In the case of Purdue specifically, with OxyContin, they knew for years, almost from the very beginning, that the drug was being abused, that people were taking it, and you know, I mentioned that thing about how it would dissolve slowly over the course of 12 hours. Well, you could easily get the coating. You could just suck the coating off of the pill or grind the coating off of the pill, and they knew for years that the drug was being abused in this way. It was only in 2010.
People were crushing it,
smoking it,
snorting it, right.
It was only in 2010 that they reformulated the drug to have what they called an abuse-resistant or abuse-deterrent version of the drug. And interestingly enough, there was probably a cynical reason for that, having to do with extending the patent on the drug. But they did this reformulation, and at that point, it was this kind of interesting thing in which years and years too late, they do the right thing that they should have done years earlier. And at the point where they did it, it may have actually driven more people to heroin. And similarly, at the point where we tighten up the prescribing habits of doctors, at that point you make it harder for people to doctor shop and get the pills that they need, and so you drive them into the black market. So I think it's, as you've said, it's complicated, and so you need to be very, very careful with any of these different types of solutions. At the risk of testing the boundaries of your cynicism, what Purdue is doing is looking abroad, looking to new users abroad. There's a company called Pharma, which is also owned by the Sacklers, which is right now, as we speak, even as they're cutting back the marketing staff and saying, oh, we're no longer going to market these opioids in the United States because we know they're addictive, they have this separate company which is looking at any number of growth markets, looking at Brazil, looking at Mexico, looking at China, and saying, gosh, you know, there's all this untreated chronic pain in this country, and all these people have been suffering with chronic pain. They will finance studies in which the people come in and they do studies and they come out and they say, 30% of the population of this country is suffering from untreated chronic pain. We have a solution, OxyContin. In some instances, the same, you mentioned earlier, the kind of self-licking ice cream cone aspect of it, in which you essentially pay doctors to produce a study that you then cite as the study that will justify what you're doing. Or they had a speakers bureau in which they would send physicians out to give these talks. In some instances, the same physicians who were 15 years ago going to places like West Virginia or Florida to give these talks are today on international junkets looking for new users.
And just out of curiosity, what's the figure? How much money has Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family made from this opiate?
Well, I mean, with the big asterisks being that we don't really know because it's a privately held company, so they don't have to make these kinds of disclosures. You will see a figure reported that OxyContin has generated $35 billion since the mid-'90s.
$35 billion.
Certainly, according to Forbes, the Sackler family is worth about $13 or $14 billion and is one of the wealthiest families in the United States.
So that 35 is probably revenue, and
Yeah,
it's probably
exactly.
a 40%
Right.
margin on that, so
Yeah.
you can get to that number pretty easily. The other thing I think that's an important dimension of this, and it's why this community event is so important and why I sort of take my hat off to this community, because it sounds like you have a program, is that, you know, there's a lot the federal government can do, although it's not really doing it. A lot of promises have been made, not much has been done. There's a lot that state governments can do, and the state leadership, governors, attorneys general, health officials are starting to feel a little more pressure locally, and they are standing up and doing a lot, but where this really gets solved is at the community level. When a community stands up, decides it's going to take this thing on head on, it gathers together the right stakeholders, which is government, law enforcement, fire, medical, dental, education, the recovery community, the treatment community, civic groups, business groups, faith-based groups, youth athletics, the whole enchilada, brings them together and decides to take this thing on. And there are a host of best practices out there that communities like this are using because nobody else is going to help them. And they stand up and they take this thing on. And there are a lot of wonderful things out there that a community can do.
This is a very preventable chronic disease. I know it's hard to understand that given the fact that we're in an opioid epidemic, but we need to shift the paradigm towards the young people in our country and begin to screen them for harmful and hazardous use patterns. SAMHSA came up with a method to do that, which is called SBIRT, screening, brief intervention, and referral to treatment. We have a department at Caron that's all about prevention. They're in 700 schools up and down the East Coast, and they're doing just that. They're looking for harmful and hazardous use patterns. They're intervening, if there are, and they're educating. And that needs to be what we start doing because we have an opportunity here to not expose the next generation to these horrible opioids.
And just, Patrick, getting back to, I've been sitting here worrying about for the people in Mexico and Brazil. Can this company just go and use the exact same marketing strategies for this exact same drug, like 20 years after this country's been launched into what is a public health emergency?
Well, yes. I mean, first of all, this is what the tobacco
even
companies
as they're
did.
being sued in the United States?
This was absolutely the playbook of the tobacco companies. They got in trouble here. They sort of hit market saturation, basically, as people started to wake up to the ills of their product, and they thought, boy, you know, a lot of people in Africa. I think they can do it. They are doing it.
But
I think
medical communities in Mexico and Brazil and all these other haven't heard about what's going on in this country?
But look, I think a big part of this for me is, and in some ways all this stuff is tied in, right? Because it goes with the stigma issue as well. Is we should be talking about it, right? I mean, I was personally writing about the Sacklers because this is a family that is celebrated. Probably here in the Hamptons, in Amagansett, where
in the Met,
Mortimer
in the
Sackler Jr.
Louvre,
lives.
in all
At the Met, the Louvre, the MoMA. After my piece came out, I had a big piece about the Sacklers. There was almost simultaneously a big piece in Esquire. Barry Meyer, an amazing reporter for the New York Times, who's been on this story since the very beginning and has a terrific book I would recommend to you, Painkiller, has done big stories in the Times. Not long after my piece came out, the New York Times called around to, I think, 22 cultural institutions that take money from the Sacklers and said, hey, so how do you feel about this? I mean, you've got colleges at Yale stripping the Calhoun name off the college because of things that the Calhoun family did hundreds of years ago. And in real time, here we are, and the Sacklers, who still have a fortune to give away, are giving this money away, and there was not a single place that said, we're going to look really hard at this, and in fact, we're not going to take any further money. Now, there are a bunch of reasons for that. It's complicated. A lot of these places, relied on public funds that aren't there anymore. But I think that to me, one part of the answer here, or at least for me as a journalist, one part of the answer is to tell these stories, get out there. I heard from so many people with stories like the Admiral's after my piece came out, families who got in touch with me and said, my brother, my cousin, my daughter died, and there was a theme in these messages, these letters and these emails I got, where people were saying, it was a relief to read the story because there is a kind of, I think in some ways, particularly American ethos of pull yourself up by your bootstraps. This is about will, individual will, and you just got to kind of grit it out. And what they were saying was, I had no idea. When you actually look at the kind of pharmacological aspect of this, and the fact that you got the whole the medical industry, the pharmaceutical industry, doctors, a kind of complacent federal government, the FDA, which signed off on this. When you look at the forces arrayed against my cousin, he didn't stand a chance, and it was unfair of us to think that he should kind of stand up against that on his own and expect any level of success. So I think we should be talking about this. I think there should be more of this.
And this ethical question it touches organizations like ours. Should we take money from a pharmaceutical company that was involved in this epidemic, in feeding this epidemic, in order to do our work of trying to counter it? And we will not do that. Others sometimes do, but we won't do that because we don't want to feed the reputation cleansing, where they can go in and, if they give me, $100,000, they can, for that $100,000, they probably get $10 million worth of reputation cleansing. We're not going to do that. It's a tempting thing for a lot of these organizations.
I was struck, Patrick, by the very end of your article when you told a story of a construction worker.
Tradesman,
A local tradesman out here in East Hampton who had worked on the Sackler home.
Yeah, and while he was addicted to OxyContin, it was a pretty extraordinary experience for me to walk with this guy to the very big property of Mortimer Sackler Jr., where this guy used to work, and he told me about getting high on that property, and he knew. I mean, he was hip to it at the time. At the time he thought he appreciated, even in the depths of his addiction. And I should say this guy is clean now, and his wife is clean, and their baby, which was born addicted to opioids, is clean. And he knew, even in the depths of it, that God, sorry.
Why does that make you so emotional?
we feel this emotion every day when we see people who will stand up and say, I'm in long-term recovery, and it's always, congratulations, round of applause, go for it. And there's some of you in this audience who are in long-term recovery, so congratulations to you. There's another...
And on this stage.
There's another, including some of us. There's another important dimension of this that I would want to mention before we did anything else, and that is we talk about safe campus, safe communities. I want to talk about safe campuses because it's a good time of year to do it. Freshmen are going to be showing up in college. Kids are going to go back to college, and there is an amazing spectrum among colleges and universities in this country of how they treat recovery. Some of them are gold standard schools, Texas Tech, Baylor University, Rutgers, some really outstanding programs where they really get it. They care about their students. There are others who do not do anything and will not do anything, partly because of stigma. They don't want parents of prospective freshmen, high school seniors, walking around their campus and seeing a poster that says, if you need recovery, if you are addicted, if whatever. They don't want people seeing that because that may mean the college has a drug problem. Well, I'm telling you, every college has a drug problem. So there are reasons why every parent in this room who has a son or daughter going off to college ought to care whether that college has a recovery program or not, even if you don't believe your son or daughter is using drugs. And the reasons are they may be using drugs and they may be in trouble and you don't know it. It could be that while they're in college, they could become addicted for no other reason than they get an injury or a dental procedure that is overprescribed. Another reason is that their roommate could be in trouble. And if there's a recovery program on campus, kids these days are very good at supporting each other, sensing each other. They could vector one of their friends into treatment or a recovery program if it's on a college. Another reason to care is it's a really good indication of whether the college cares about its students. And then finally, the last reason for having a recovery program on campus is these kids are going to show up, and if it's an overt program that all the kids know about, they accept it. We've seen this. And it turns them into better citizens so that when they graduate, they will go out into the world and have less stigma in their own minds, and maybe we can win this thing.
Finally, Doctor, you have actually helped train other doctors now in recognizing the signs of addiction, in not saying, go home, just chill out, here's some Valium. I mean, there's a lot of educating that needs to be done just, at your GP's office when you go in and admit you're anxious and you need a little something to take the edge off, or for them to recognize when a patient's in trouble.
The curricula in medical schools is changing slowly but surely. We have a residency training program at Caron. 100 primary care residents come through Caron every year to learn about addiction and how to treat it right.
But are we talking like 10%, 50%, 70% of America's doctors now know about this serious disease?
I would say that they all are aware of the serious disease. How many of them want to tackle it and ask the questions with the patient in the room is a different story altogether.
Can I ask a related question? You mentioned at the beginning that if you look back at the origins of this crisis, that physicians on some level share part of the blame.
We do.
How does that affect I mean, physicians are going to be so important in terms of the solution. Would you say that there's how does a sense of culpability or a sense that, perhaps we were wrong, how does that play out in addressing this?
Well, I could say this, that we're at a 10-year low when it comes to opioid prescriptions in this country. So we are acknowledging our mistake, and we are trying to forge ahead and not make that same mistake. On the ride here, I actually was called by the president of the American Society of Addiction Medicine and asked to chair a committee of physician in training committee to bring education to medical students and residents. So I'm just very happy to be part of the solution, and I can't wait to get going and really start to educate our young minds around addiction.
But the point is it's one thing to understand that there's a crisis right now of addiction in this country. It's another thing to actually be trained as a doctor in how to recognize it, what to ask your patients, what to do if you think there's a problem, where to send them to help a family like the Admirals when they're in a moment of crisis and need help fast.
I think the medical community is moving in the right direction, but too slowly.
Exactly.
And I refer back to the non-scientific thing I mentioned earlier of of not hearing any doctor or dentist, give a verbal warning to a patient. We went and visited, there's a remarkable hospital in Park City, Utah, run by Intermountain, if you're familiar with that, where they have got some amazing signage in that hospital. Every elevator door is a warning about opioid use. Every counter, reception desk is a education in which drugs are actually opioids and which aren't. Every table in their cafeteria is a warning. And they did some data science on their physicians to find out, what were their prescription practices. And they were able to show some pretty amazing numbers in that they interviewed patients also. How much of this stuff did you take? And they were finding that the patients were actually taking somewhere around 50% of what was being prescribed. So they asked their doctors, would you please start prescribing 50% of what you used to prescribe? There were a number of physicians in that hospital who bitterly resisted the signage campaign, who really were against it, and who did not want to change their prescription habits. But what they found over about 3 or 4 months is that some of these doctors were coming back and saying, all this signage is starting to cause us to have some pretty powerful conversations with our patients. And they're starting to see a dip. It's leveled off. It's not going as far as it needs to go in terms of prescription practice. So I think it's going to be a while. I also have a lot of faith in the young generation of physicians and dentists coming in who I think have a better grip on this and are maybe getting that initial education rather than some of the older folks, frankly, that are sort of have their habits ingrained and don't necessarily want to change.
I think we're going to open up for questions in just one moment, but I wanted to ask all three of you finally, we were talking about the fact that we need to have more discussions about this. Admiral, you were very brave in writing that article with your wife for The Atlantic about the loss of your son. Patrick, obviously, your article was huge. But it was really interesting because I'm struck by the fact that you had people contacting you to say that even though they'd experienced this disease in their own family until they read your article, they didn't really understand the enormous forces their family member was fighting in the face of this disease. Given the fact that we are losing more people to addiction every year than to gun violence, than to HIV at the highest rate of its deadliest year, more people have died from addiction than died in the Afghan, Vietnam, and Iraq wars combined. Why aren't we
in 1 year, by the way.
In
Every
1
year.
year. Why aren't we talking about this as a society more?
It boils down to stigma. It really does. It's not going to happen in my family. It only happens to dirty, disgusting people. And we're just not going to deal with this. These people deserve what they are doing. And it's not recognized as the disease that it really is. That it doesn't care if you're black, white, young, old, Republican or Democrat, rich or poor. It does not care. It will get you.
I think it's complexity. I mean, I think that there's a, I don't know if you're any John Oliver fans out there, but John Oliver
Love him.
did a segment on net neutrality, and he had this line which I thought were words to live by. He said, if you want to do something evil, wrap it in something boring. I think that there's obviously a huge amount of human drama here, but when we talk about the solutions, when we talk about the causes and the solutions, it's just a very multivariable.
It's very complicated.
It's highly complicated, and I think that makes it hard to. I mean, I'll give you an example. President Trump has spoken a bit about the crisis as recently as last week when he said that he wanted to have Jeff Sessions look into prosecuting some of these companies. But what he tends to do is he talks about fentanyl, and he talks about China and Mexico, and there is a kind of clarity in being able to say that, right? There's this bad stuff that's coming into our country from outside, and
It's point at somebody else.
Well, it's pointed at somebody else, but there's a kind of, that's like legible. It's legible on a bumper sticker. You can get it. And when you have a conversation like this, I think it takes a while to unpack it. The reality is both closer to home, I think.
The enemies can be also American drug companies
absolutely.
who might be also donating to your campaign.
Yeah, but that's a tougher conversation to have. And so I do think some of it is just the inherent complexity of this.
we need to look at what we did with the HIV/AIDS epidemic. And it was all about prevention, education, research, treatment, standards of care in treatment as well, and also support systems. So we need recovery supports. The statistics say that if someone gets to a year of recovery, they're less apt to relapse. So the relapse rate, the chance of relapse is less than sustainable recovery for the rest of their life at 1 year. So
At 1 year, like total,
Sober.
or 1 year after you get out of?
1 year total. 1 year total, your risk of relapse is less than 50%. And the chances that you'll go on to have a recovering life is greater than 50%. So there's hope that we can do something about this disease, and it needs to be dealt as a chronic disease. We have to start talking in those terms.
And we have to stop expecting people to simply have more willpower and stop, or go to a 30-day treatment center, get out and be all better, and now we're going to get back to life. You know, it doesn't work like that. All right. Does anybody have any questions? We wanted to give everybody a chance if they did want to ask anything. It's so dark. Oh, gosh, now we can see you. Hi. Here. Hold on. Oh, there's microphones, too.
I just wanted to preface the question first with a statement. I think that there's a paradox in medical care in that our insurance companies and pharmaceutical companies are predominantly public companies, and their management has a fiduciary responsibility to their stockholders to maximize their profits. And then we ask them to behave altruistically in a way that will benefit our society but diminish the profits for the stockholders. And I think we've set this system up for failure to start. Okay? So should these companies be managed like utilities? Should we not allow laissez-faire economics to determine what our pharmaceutical companies do and our insurance companies do?
Do you want to take that?
You're raising a really important point. And if it's a public company, they have to be responsible to their shareholders. We all know that, and a lot of people in this room are in business. So there may be two ways to approach it. You know, it's tempting to increase regulation. I think in some cases that's probably appropriate. And in others, I think it's education, where if I can convince an insurance company that paying for a buprenorphine dose in an emergency room is the surest way to get somebody into long-term treatment, but it's going to cost you $400 that you weren't ordinarily going to pay as an insurance company for an emergency room visit, but it's going to save you an awful lot of money because that person's not going to end up back in that emergency room, then you might have a shot at it. So some combination of regulation and education of these companies might be in effect, but you're asking a question that is as complicated as the epidemic itself.
Yeah,
I do think, though, that a company shouldn't be saying this drug is not addictive publicly and exchanging memos privately saying, holy cow, people are getting hooked. You know, we have, Houston, we have a problem.
I think there were two issues. One is that I don't think the profit motive is an adequate motive because death is really cheap, okay? Long-term care is really expensive. So it shouldn't be based entirely upon profit. It should be based upon what's best for our society. Okay, so I don't think you can use that as a motive. Okay. I think that, again, if you allow a profit motive, whatever you think is ethical, the companies will push the envelope to that border, okay, and some a little bit further. So again, you're creating a situation where you're asking a company to behave against the interests of their stockholders to improve society.
Unless you force them to, and that's the regulation piece.
Okay, do we have another question? Yes.
Hi, first of all, just thank you so much for this panel this evening. All three of you gave me so much to think about. As someone who works in the recovery field, in the treatment field, and as someone in long-term recovery, I think a lot about that question you just asked. You know, like, what do we need to do differently? And we talked about the different complexities. But something that I'm curious to hear you guys talk a little bit about is, what about the conversation and the messaging around the symptoms of the disease of addiction? Because they are very different from other chronic diseases. I think that needs to be talked about, and it needs to be reframed, and it needs to be explained for people who don't understand this disease. You know, when I talk to family members who don't have addiction in their family, and I describe some of the things that have happened in my family, they're just like, what? You know? And I'm like, oh no, that's just kind of how it goes, you know? When you have this illness in your family, these are the things you can expect to happen generation after generation. And the thing is, when people are puking and robbing people and, you know, hurting people, the symptoms that go with this disease are pretty horrific. And so how do we as a society help each other understand that, yeah, this isn't good. We're not saying these are okay things, but the fact is they go along with this disease. Does that make sense? Like, these symptoms are really awful compared to the symptoms that, say, come with when someone finds a tumor, you know, on a lung. It's a lot different than when, you know, someone has that first drink and gets hooked on alcohol or gets hooked on a drug, and they start doing all sorts of things that are really reprehensible.
I mean, you make a very good point. It's a chronic brain disease with behavioral manifestations, and we recoil with those manifestations. But if you think of the progress we've made in the mental health world, another set of brain diseases with behavioral manifestations, we've been able to have at least conversations, cogent ones, where we can look at a behavioral health issue as a manifestation of their disease and invite them into treatment and recognize that they are in need of cogent, coherent treatment, and that the manifestations of that disease shouldn't preclude them from that treatment.
Campaign on depression, for example. It's just a chemical, and for decades we saw those billboards. Maybe we need something like that around addiction, you know, to emphasize that it really truly is a brain disease.
No, I agree. I think that's the kind of campaign we can borrow from. And we've done well with other chronic diseases. We just have to step up to the plate with this chronic disease.
Okay. Oh, yes.
This is on. Hey, it's Alec. So quick question, and you may have touched on this in some way, but in backstage we talked about this, which is, you know, how people are in general acquiring these drugs. They either get a prescription themselves, they're stealing someone else's prescription, or if you could discuss for a moment the black market and you know, where do all these pills come from? You know, is it like Breaking Bad and there's people like making this stuff in a house somewhere? Or, and then secondly, which authority do you think in our society is best positioned to make real change? Is it any White House that's in power? Is it regardless of which White House in the past, is it a congressional committee? Is it the FDA themselves? Who has the authority to make change in this area now? They could change it now if they wanted to.
I could talk about where the drugs are coming from. I mean, if you think about the progression from opioid pills, where you outstrip your financial resources and turn to, you know, street opioid pills, that same dealer has heroin in the ready. So they're going to offer you heroin if you can't afford the pills because it's cheaper, and you're going to go for it. The tolerance will increase very quickly, and then you'll be a regular customer. And nowadays, the third phase is synthetic opioids. It's fentanyl, precursors of fentanyl, congeners of fentanyl that are being sold by that same dealer. So that's how everyone that comes to Caron is getting their substances. They make that transition from prescription to illicit substance.
And fentanyl is made where?
Fentanyl is primarily made in China and brought over to the U.S.
Another thing to be careful of, you know, many of us have people come work on our homes. If you have been prescribed an opioid pain reliever by a physician, and if you decide you didn't need to take it all, and you don't throw it away, you don't dispose of it properly, and you leave it in your medicine cabinet, countless stories of workers coming through, rifling through people's prescription cabinets, or not prescription, just medicine cabinets, and pulling out the opioids that they find there. So there's a substantial portion of people who are becoming addicted to these drugs because they are using what a physician prescribed to them for a chronic injury or something like that. There are also a significant number of these drugs that are being what they call diverted in any number of ways, including people stealing them out of their medicine cabinets, or their teenagers stealing them out of their medicine cabinets and taking them to a party and putting them in what they call a Skittle bowl, to people actually selling them. A whole host of different ways that these drugs, the ones that are actually made by pharmaceutical companies, are finding their way into people's hands. And then there are the prescription or the counterfeit pill pressers, who are really dangerous because most of them are putting some amount of fentanyl in what is otherwise a drug, and you find all kinds of other things in there, like cement.
Right, and
other
fentanyl's
stuff.
cheap. That's the problem.
And you don't know what's in there,
Cheap.
and it can kill you. And you don't have to be addicted to one of these things to die from it. And the other thing is that opioids, in particular fentanyl, are now finding their way into methamphetamines and cocaine and even marijuana.
Synthetic marijuana, that's the K2, all the, remember all the people...
Not even K2, just straight up marijuana can find in there. And we know of a woman we've spoken with in North Carolina whose son was not addicted to anything other than just partying. And once a month, he and his buddies would go out and party. Otherwise, he was just go to work like everybody else. And they drink a lot, they do a little coke, a little weed and all that. Well, it turned out this one night, the coke that her son did was laced with fentanyl. And he was not addicted, but he died that night from an overdose of fentanyl. So it's everywhere. You need to tell your kids, be very careful out there, because your first one could be your last one.
And what was the other part of your question?
Which government authority could
The answer is all of them.
Yes, I agree.
Right. But wouldn't if the White House said, this is it, FDA, you need to make this a campaign, let's start a public awareness campaign, let's start a dialogue about this, let's crack down. I mean, I guess...
Not everything is in the White House or even the federal government's control. There are a lot of terrific policies that they could espouse nationwide. Prescription drug monitoring programs could be much stronger state across state. The limitations on the amount that some states have actually put into practice, I think New York has, or Pennsylvania certainly has, limitations on 7 days of opioid pain relief for an adult and 5 for a child or something like that. I can't believe children will get this. So there are a number of federal level policies, and I've sort of joked, but I'm really serious when I say that the most important thing Chris Christie will ever do in his public life is that he chaired the President's Opioid Commission that came up with a ton of really good recommendations, very few of which are being implemented, frankly. The National Governors Association at the states level have come up with a tremendous list of policies that states and the federal government should be adopting, very few of which have been adopted. So there, at every level, including the local community level, communities standing up and taking on this problem with policies and actions at every single level. That's what it takes. That's the breadth and depth of the complexity of this epidemic. You have to do all of the 6 things that I mentioned, or you'll fail. If you do 5 of the 6, you fail. And you have to do it at every single level in our country.
In terms of those action plans that aren't being implemented, is your sense that is it because they're cost prohibitive? Is it because of inertia? Is it because there's actually kind of organized efforts to drag feet or obstruct?
Well, a lot of them are expensive. I think the federal government, the Congress voted, $6 billion last year or something to allocate to this. When you start dividing that among the states, it gets pretty small fairly quickly. And some of it's just bureaucratic inertia, some of it's stigma, where they just don't get these things done. And it's great to have a news event, a stand-up press event, where you can declare that this is a public emergency when it's in fact a national emergency. And then you go on with life. And as we all know in Washington, the news cycle has about a 1-day endurance factor.
10 minutes.
10 minutes. And then it's on to something else, sometimes intentionally.
Wow. Yes.
I wanted to, thank you. I wanted to add on to what you were saying. Sorry, I get emotional, but I'll get over it. I come from alcoholism, so a different type of addiction, but something I wanted to not ask, but rather share with the room, that I think that one of the most important things that we can actually do is to, either you're in politics, right, or you're a celebrity, or you give away a lot of money. Like, there are different powers that we all have. But if you happen to have the power of having lived through this, there's something to be said about talking about it, right? So that's exceptionally powerful just with whoever you know, right? So I started talking openly about my history of this in 2004, and I own a company. I had a lot of staff. So at that point, I was quite young. And just to talk about that, and I know my mom was in my company. My father was the alcoholic. And, I remember my mom was like, oh, my God, you're crazy, right? But just by talking about it in a loving way made a huge impact to all the staff that I had at the time. And to your point, like, they all came calling after, emailing, calling, talking, whatever. I moved out here a lot later, in 2008, and from then on, I would talk about this disease that I knew so intimately with people in the Hamptons, and they were horrified, because they were like, Jenny, don't say that. This is your father. Pay respect. And I was like, no, I love my father. It was just part of my life at that point. It was so normal. And I wanted to share it just to the people who are here, in case anybody has gone through this, that I think there's power in just keep talking about it. You're talking about your son, and obviously that's going to help a tremendous amount of people. You're talking about the story, that whatever that is, even though you won't always be thankful for it at the time, the thanks comes later, but there is something about just openly talking about it. Every now and then somebody will say thank you and they'll ask for help, or you'll know who to send them or where to send them when the time comes.
You're so right. And what we've found when we talk to a high school, for example, is that what you don't say is, this is dirty, it's rotten, don't do it, it's going to ruin your life, you're going to turn into a loser. That doesn't get through to them. What gets through to them is a couple of things. One, telling them a story of someone who's been lost, not necessarily ours, somebody else's, where these kids could live vicariously through that kid's life, and they see it, that it could actually happen to them. And the other is to educate them on, because these are smart kids. Their prefrontal cortexes may not be fully developed. They may not have the greatest judgment in the world, but they're smart. And they understand when you describe to them the physiology of addiction, and they're on the edge of their seat when you're talking about this. And then if you can get somebody in recovery talking to them, it just puts that last layer of icing on the cake, and we've found that it's very effective. And you're so right. We have a hard time as an organization measuring our output. It's easy to measure our input. How many audiences have we talked to? How many articles have we written? That sort of thing. But what kind of a difference are we really making? It's hard to quantify that. But when you get a note from somebody who says, I'm sitting here in a hospital emergency room with my 14-year-old son who is addicted to opioids, and we've decided we're going to take this on, and we're going to get him into long-term treatment. And the reason we're here is because we read your stuff. You can go on for another week. Or read his stuff, or anybody else's stuff, or your story that you might tell to your coworkers or your staff or your neighbors. That, you're so right, is important, and that helps people shed the stigma.
Is that time? I think that's it. Oh, okay, we'll do one. Sure.
Hi, I'm so happy that you're doing this. I think it's fabulous, and I'm in long-term recovery. My son's in long-term recovery. Paradoxically, my husband died of a horrible cancer. There was oxy throughout this experience, and the flip side of what you're saying is when someone is dying of cancer, they actually need to take that stuff all the time. In our case, both of us were sober and giving my dying husband oxy, which was essential. So it's a very complex combination, and I think the medicine cabinet thing is critical. I think as I've seen people emerge from operations, instead of the doctor handling pain meds, they hand it off to a nurse. And the nurses involved have very limited judgment, very limited discretion. They're instructed by doctors. So, in my opinion, both nurses and doctors, and including pharmacies themselves, need to be made aware of this. There's 50 Percocet or 50 oxys given out for one small operation routinely. Why there is no limit on the number of pills given out for medical reasons, I have no idea. The other question I have is, do you think there's a correlation between giving small kids Ritalin and other drugs by child psychiatrists that teach them then that they need a pill to get through life, and then later the same kids wind up dying from opioids?
I'll take that one. My son was misdiagnosed as being ADHD
Mine too.
when he actually had anxiety and depression.
Mine too.
Adderall is the worst thing you can give to somebody who has anxiety. And that's what started him down the road to self-medicate, because he would take a little bit of alcohol from our cabinet at night in order to come down off of the Adderall. And if you look at the prescription rate in this country for Adderall, does it sound familiar? A quadrupling of Adderall has been, and college kids are taking it as a study drug. 4-year-old kids are being given Adderall.
Housewives are taking it.
Yeah, and so you're so right. And that's why, as a parent, as a grandparent, it's so important to get a second opinion. Be, a skeptical patient or parent or grandparent, and really ask hard questions of the people who are giving you these drugs to see if they're really the right thing to do.
I think 4-year-olds who are given Adderall, I think it's criminal. The other thought I have, listening to this amazing night, is what if there was a great way to make money from the anti-addiction meds, if that business was really stimulated?
Well, as long as we have a regulation that limits the number of patients that a physician can be prescribing buprenorphine for, no limit on how many patients they can prescribe opioids for, but it's what, 250 now for a physician?
If you have board certification in
Yes,
addiction
and
medicine.
after you're certified, which
And
you
that's if
didn't need
they're
the
even-
certification to prescribe the
But
OxyContin
yes,
to begin
it's
with.
a great point. Let's incentivize recovery rather than addiction.
Right.
So.
Before I thank our panel, I really want to thank the community for turning up these last 3 weeks. We could go on for all evening, it seems, and really have just scratched the surface. So I wanted to thank you. And I also wanted to acknowledge that we have in the audience Drew Scott and Jay Schneiderman, and they're with the Southampton Opioid Addiction Task Force. So they're just great. They're doing great work. There are materials out on the table outside on S.A.F.E, and we'll make everything available on the great links for resources on the website, the Guildhall website. So I wanted to also thank our wonderful sponsors for making this possible, and Guildhall. So thank you very much. And of course, and our panel, most importantly, thank you very much.